Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
How lovely to see you, and thank you for coming out on this Sunday evening to the latest in the lectures that have been organised by Mission and Discipleship Group here. I don't know whether this is the fourth lecture or whether it's the first in year 2 of the lectures, but it's definitely number 4, but I don't know whether it's also number 1. Anyway, it is a first in some respects, because the other lecturers that we've had here have been people that I have known from my time at New College, but tonight's lecturer only arrived 7 years ago, and I've been away from New College for a lot longer than 7 years. We are delighted though that she has come. We have Dr. Suzanna Miller, who is a lecturer in Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, I think I've got that right, has many publications to her name, and has a particular interest in the interplay between the Bible and animal ethics, which is the title of her talk, The Hebrew Bible and Animal Ethics. And I'm not going to take any more time, but others say thank you for coming, and we look forward to what you've got to say. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's really lovely to be here. Thank you so much for the kind invitation, and thank you all for giving up your Sunday night to come and think with me about this topic that I hope by the end of today you will think is both important and interesting. So, animal ethics is a growing concern globally. What is our responsibility to the millions of cows, pigs, sheep and chicken reared and slaughtered in industrial agriculture? What is an appropriate ethical response to the dwindling numbers of non-domesticated species who are threatened by habitat destruction, biodiversity loss and climate crisis? Closer to home, how should I treat my 2 cats, Kohelet and Solomon, in a way to facilitate their flourishing? And I couldn't help but put this very cute photo up. I have this pinned up next to my desk at work as well. Sorry, my Hebrew got scrambled for any Hebrew boffins. That was their names at one point in Hebrew. Anyway, such questions, I suggest, are ethically crucial. Animals are widely, and rightly in my view, acknowledged to be sentient creatures, capable of having meaningful experiences, of forming relationships, of suffering, and of flourishing. Given this reality, animals demand ethical attention. And given that the Bible has a formative influence on the ethics of individuals, probably many people in this room, and societies, it must contribute to this conversation. And that's where I come in. I'm trained as a biblical scholar, the Hebrew Bible specifically, and I won't be speaking about the New Testament today, not because I don't think that it matters, but just because of the limitations of my own expertise. I'm also a keen reader and thinker in animal ethics, though this isn't my primary academic home. And one of my core academic goals is to bring these disciplines into conversation with one another. In fact, the Bible and animal ethics are rarely brought together. Animal ethicists rarely think that the Bible can enrich their work on moral theory and practice, whereas biblical scholars rarely think that animal ethics can enrich their interpretation of given texts. Where they are brought together, it's usually done in quite a simplistic way, both in terms of which texts tend to be the focus of attention and in terms of how they're interpreted. So certain texts tend to dominate the conversation, especially, as you might guess, Genesis 1 to 3, with the creation of humans, the command to rule and subdue creation, and then the story of creation of animals in the Garden of Eden, and you're all very familiar with those texts. Those stories tend to dominate the discussion. And within the literature of animal ethics, a simplistic negative interpretation tends to be given. So, for example, in a seminal work of animal ethics literature, Peter Singer, who wrote the book Animal Liberation, said, "There is no serious challenge to the overall view laid down in Genesis that the human species is the pinnacle of creation and has God's permission to kill and eat other animals." This is in a chapter of his book where he's tracking the historical roots of what he sees as a very anthropocentric modern situation where humans can just exploit animals as they wish. He roots it in the Hebrew Bible, as per this quotation, and then he traces it through some later traditions as well. Another example comes from an influential article by Lynn White Jr. called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. And Lynn White says, referring to the story of the Garden of Eden, Man named all the animals, thus establishing his dominance over them. God planned all of this explicitly for man's benefit and rule. No item in the physical creation had any purpose save to serve man's purposes. So he again gives this very negative interpretation of Genesis 2 to 3, and this leads him to the conclusion that he lays out in this article, that as he puts it, Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever seen. So quite condemnatory terms for both of those animal ethics thinkers. However, I suggest that it's helpful to complexify this picture, both in terms of which texts we think about and in terms of how we interpret them. So perhaps we should look beyond Genesis 1 to 3, which is indeed what I will be doing in this lecture, and perhaps we should be open to different possibilities of animal ethics in the Bible. In my research, I found a lot of moral complexity on this issue, which is perhaps unsurprising, given that the Bible is from a culture in which most people were agriculturalists, interacting daily with domesticated animals, and yet were threatened by predatory animals as well. So in this lecture, I want to suggest that the Bible and animal ethics can be really fruitful dialogue partners. Some of the main ideas that current animal ethicists work with are there, I suggest, nascent already in biblical text. Now, the Bible doesn't fully theorize or work out these positions, and yet the same ethical impulses that inform modern animal ethics, I suggest, may already be there. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to consider 3 major positions in contemporary animal ethics, and then think about how we might bring those into conversation with certain genres of biblical texts. So I'll consider animal rights, which might be the first place that many people go to when thinking about animal ethics, and I'll bring that into conversation with biblical legal codes. I'll then turn to virtue ethics and think about biblical wisdom literature, and finally think a little about care ethics and biblical narratives. I'm only going to have time for 3 very short case studies, one in each area, to offer some brief examples of the sorts of things that I think are possible. So let's begin with animal rights. Animal rights may be the first thing that many people think of when they think about animal ethics, which I think may be unhelpful given that there are many different positions in animal ethics, some of which I'll be dealing with today. And yet the animal rights approach is still prevalent, particularly in contemporary discourse, and is important to think about. I think there may also be a tendency to kind of denigrate this position as being a bit of an extremist tendency. But if you will, let's think seriously about it and some of its implications. See if we can get my headset in the right position. So, thinking first of all about what rights mean within ethical discourse. Rights discourse is most familiar to many of us in the context of human rights. So rights, as you know, are basic entitlements that should be granted to everybody, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, their gender, all that sort of thing. They can be framed in both positive and negative terms, so we might think of rights to something or protections from something. So, for example, we might think of the right to life, which is the flip side of the protection from death, or the right to bodily integrity, the flip side of protection from physical harm. Rights like this are widely acknowledged to be basic and inviolable. So Gary Francione, who's an ethicist particularly interested in rights, he describes rights as, quote, a type of protection that does not evaporate in the face of consequential considerations. So it doesn't evaporate, it doesn't simply disappear just because it might conflict with the interest of another person. Which isn't to negate, by the way, the very real moral dilemmas that can occur when 2 sets of basic rights come into conflict. But in general, basic rights don't evaporate, he says. Rights like this can be a basis for legal and political regulations, which can make them very helpful in practical terms. So they have correlative obligations. So the right to life, for example, creates the law, do not kill, to put it very simply. Or the right to bodily integrity, do not cause bodily harm. The question emerges of who should hold rights like this. I think most of us would agree that all humans should hold these rights, regardless of their social location. Most people agree that all humans have moral, legal, political personhood, and that they have interests worth protecting. But the question that I'm particularly interested in is whether rights like this should be extended to non-human animals, and if so, which rights, to what extent, how should that be enacted? Some thinkers within animal ethics, such as Tom Regan, whose book was quite seminal in this regard, The Case for Animal Rights, argues quite strongly that basic legal rights should be extended to non-human animals. They argue that animals have no morally relevant characteristic which would include humans but exclude animals. So, for example, the classic criterion might be something like intellect or rationality. However, if we sort of think through the extreme cases of that criterion doesn't apply to all humans. So it excludes very young children, it excludes people in comas, it excludes people with severe mental difficulties. So even a criterion like that already begins to become more complicated than it might first appear. And many animals might fit into that criterion. We all know about dolphins who are capable of amazing feats, or dogs, or chimpanzees, or elephants, or other intelligent life forms. Reagan and other ethicists of his ilk argue that instead of thinking about intellect and rationality, we should think in terms of sentience or subjectivity, or Reagan says beings that are a subject of a life, he says. Any creature that has a sense of selfhood, a sense of subjectivity, should be extended some form of basic rights. They possess interests that should be protected. So that's a little bit about how animal rights discourse gets tended to be talked about. But we might ask, is there any evidence of anything akin to animal rights in the biblical texts? Are there any inviolable rights that are extended not just to humans but also to animals? I want to argue, and I'm basing some of this on the fantastic work of Saul Olyan, who wrote this book, just came out last year, Animal Rights and the Hebrew Bible. And Olyan argues, and I think that he's right, that there are some texts in the Hebrew Bible that have something akin to this, not necessarily going all the way, but something like this underlying their underlying ethics. The examples that I want to take are particularly taken from the legal codes of the Hebrew Bible, specifically from what we call the Covenant Code, which is a set of laws in the book of Exodus. So let me just take you through this example. So we have two laws here, one in Exodus 23, 10 to 11, and then the following one in Exodus 23, 12. I'll just read this out. The first one says, "For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field may eat. You should do likewise with your vineyard and with your olive orchard." And then the next law says, 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your servant woman and the alien may be refreshed. So for these laws, there is some debate in biblical scholarship about to what extent they would have been practiced. Whether they were actually legally binding for all people is a question which is hotly debated among scholars. But whether they were actually practiced or not, they do present an ideal of what people should be doing with their land, with their animals. So both of these laws express the sabbatical principle, which may be familiar to some of you, which is this kind of 6+1 patterning of time. So in the first law, we have 6 years where you grow your produce, and then 1 year where you let your land grow fallow. In the second law, you have 6 days where you do your work, 1 day where you rest. The addressee of these laws is some sort of an agriculturalist, probably a head of a household. He's somebody who has land, he has servants, and he has animals. And the laws are addressed to him, and they give him certain legal obligations about what to do for these other creatures, including humans and non-human animals, who are the beneficiaries of the laws. So these obligations then, a set of legal obligations about how he should manage his household. It's interesting to me that no motivations or reasons are given for this. It's not do this because X, Y, Z. It's just do this. The motivation is the benefit that comes to the one who is, I argue, a right holder. When we get into later sections of today's talk, we'll see some motivations in terms of developing virtuous character or developing relationships, which don't come up here. So the obligation in the first law is to provide food to these other beings, and in the second one to provide rest. And these obligations may presuppose a set of rights belonging to the beneficiaries, so the right to have access to food, the right to have time to rest. And as I said before, obligations and rights are closely correlated within this discourse. These are presented as absolute injunctions, so there are no get-out clauses. There are no, in Franciane's terms, consequential considerations which might allow the landholder to renege on his responsibility. So it doesn't say, unless you're having a hard time and need to keep the land, even if he would benefit from working his oxen harder, these laws don't give him any get-out clauses. The beneficiaries of the laws are, in the first instance, the poor of your people and the beasts of the field. And in the second instance, we have your ox and your donkey, and then the son of your servant woman and the alien. So it's interesting to me here that humans and animals are being classed together. So it's not simply the case that humans are granted rights and animals are not, but both of them are being held in the same category. So the human-animal boundary doesn't seem to be the primary determinative criterion here. There does, however, seem to be a hierarchy in the first law. So notice that the poor of the people eat first, and then the animals eat second. How that would be practically manageable is a different question, but the law does seem to presuppose a hierarchy. The first law primarily pertains to people outside the household, so the poor of the people in general, the beasts of the field in general. The second law pertains particularly to household members, so the son of your servant woman, the ox and the donkey, who would be sort of part of your broader household, particularly in an ancient Israelite society where oxen and donkeys would kind of live with you in the courtyard area of the home. These groups may be considered to be particularly vulnerable groups at risk of harm, and the law seems to assume that they have interests worth protecting. So, in Oljan's work, he argues quite strongly that these laws presuppose the legal personhood and the rights of the beneficiaries, including the non-human animals. These laws, I should say, aren't sort of aberrations or anomalies, but there are other laws as well in the Hebrew Bible which suggest something like this. So the Sabbath of the land law, the first one, is repeated and expanded in Leviticus 25, and then the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath law, is repeated and expanded in Deuteronomy 5. And both of the expansions include more groups within their remit, so more groups of humans and more groups of animals as the beneficiaries of the law. So that's just been a very brief exposition of potential instances of animal rights in the Hebrew Bible. Basic entitlements that don't evaporate in the face of consequential considerations being extended to non-human animals. But that's not the only way that I think animal ethics can be helpful for thinking about biblical texts and vice versa. So I want to think next about a different ethical framework, which is virtue ethics. Let's have a sip of water. So within virtue ethics, the focus of ethics isn't so much about rules or laws or regulations, rather it's about developing virtue, developing a certain sort of character. And right actions on this ethical theory naturally flow from a virtuous presupposition. So a sort of being that gives rise to doing is the ethical idea here. It's been used a little within animal rights literature, animal ethics literature more generally. So in this volume, for example, there is a chapter by Rosalind Hursthouse where she applies virtue ethics to thinking about non-human animals. Virtue ethics is most closely associated with Greek thinkers, so a slightly different context from the Hebrew Bible. We might think of Aristotle and Socrates and people like that as being virtue ethicists. However, quite recently there's been a wave of biblical scholarship that has found this sort of perspective in biblical texts as well, particularly in the biblical wisdom literature, so the books of Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, and then Ben Sira and Wisdom of Solomon, which are slightly later and are in the apocryphal books. So William Brown, for example, who's a scholar of wisdom literature, says that character development, or virtue ethics, is the raison d'etre of wisdom literature. It's what they're about. They're intended to form a righteous character in their listeners or their readers. And this fits in with their genre. books like Proverbs give moral instructions for how to be a good person, to live a good life, not hard and fast laws like in the book of Exodus, but the pedagogical texts intended to form a righteous character. And the book of Proverbs in particular has been seen as a key locus for this. So it's been compared with works of Aristotle and Socrates and other virtue ethicists. So Proverbs is where I'm going to focus, and I'm going to just give you a little bit of a background to how virtue ethics works in Proverbs before we get into my key example. So the book of Proverbs, if you're not familiar with it, focuses particularly on key character types. It's less concerned with specific situations, like the laws are, but more with overall disposition. So each proverb in the collection tends to focalise just one character and gives an example of something that they do, or something that happens to them, or something that they are, some facet of their disposition. And it seems to suggest that their actions naturally flow from their character type. The characters are often set in binary pairs, so you have a virtuous character being paired with a character with vice, or a wicked character. And the key pairs are indeed the righteous and the wicked, occur quite a lot, and also the wise and the foolish. So you have those kind of moral dispositions, righteousness and wickedness, being paired with intellectual dispositions, wisdom and foolishness. And those two things, morality and intellect in the book, are very, very closely connected. It seems to be the impression that you can't be wise without also being righteous, or you can't be wicked without also being foolish, and vice versa. They're not identical, so wisdom and righteousness don't have the same content, but they do occur in the same person, it seems, in the book. And the pedagogical goal of the book is to inculcate that sort of wisdom, that sort of righteousness in its student. So there are repeated calls in the book to become wise, to become like the wise person, which necessarily entail becoming righteous too. And there are many different examples in the book of types of behaviour which would fall into this pattern, some of which, particularly interesting to me, include animals. So let's have a little look at one of these. Oh, my Hebrew has gone all squiggly again. This often happens. Word processors and things can't really deal with Hebrew. The Hebrew is here, and I'm going to be referring to it a little bit. It's not as scrambled as the previous one, so that's good. So I'll just read the Hebrew quickly, if anybody knows Hebrew. It says, Yodei tzadik nefesh behemto, v'rachamei risha'im achzarim. Sorry that the bottom is cut off. But a rough translation of this: a righteous man knows the soul of his cattle, but the mercies of wicked men are cruel. So quite a short little proverb, but I think worth digging into. So in the first half of the proverb, we have the righteous man knowing the soul of his cattle. The righteous man here, the tzaddik, is one of our key character types in Proverbs. This is the epitome of what you should be like, a righteous person. It's one of our moral terms, yet interestingly here it's being paired with an intellectual capacity, knowing something, yodeia. So this word to know occurs quite a lot in the book of Proverbs and elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. And it is an intellectual kind of knowing, but it's also deeper than that. It can also connote intimacy, can also be a sort of knowing that leads to action. And there's another proverb as well that talks about, it says, know well the face of your sheep. So it's used in that context as well. Here, the man isn't knowing the face of his animal, but he's knowing the nefesh, which roughly translated, the soul of his cattle. The translation of this, I should say, is quite disputed. In the Hebrew Bible, the soul isn't conceived of as a kind of disembodied spiritual substance, as it might be in Greek thought. Rather, it's a very embodied capacity. The nefesh is found in the blood. It's a kind of life force, vitality, which animates both animals and humans in the Hebrew Bible. So in the Genesis stories, both animals and humans are described as nefesh chaya, living souls. The term has quite a broad semantic range, so it can also connote appetite and desire. So in this context, the righteous man is knowing the appetite, the desire, the life, the capacities of his cattle, behemto. The word for cattle there primarily refers to large cattle, so your oxen and your cows, but it can also refer to smaller animals, to sheep and goats as well. And notice that it's his cattle, suggesting some sort of a relationship between them. So, that first half then shows the kind of the intellectual disposition of the morally upright person, and it does so precisely oriented towards a non-human animal. So virtue in this proverb seems to have its outworkings in the non-human sphere. The way you show your righteousness in this proverb is something to do with how you treat your non-human animals. Presumably, this virtuous disposition will lead to action, will lead to giving the cattle what they need to survive and flourish, perhaps filling their appetites in a physical way, or perhaps more than that, doing what will satisfy the soul of your animal. So that's the first half of the proverb. The second half of the proverb, Berachamei Risha'im Achsari, that the mercies of wicked men are cruel. So here we have our wicked men, our Risha'im, which is kind of the polar opposite. That's, as I mentioned, something that happens a lot in Proverbs, where you get the polar character types. So in this context, the wicked man is the polar opposite of the righteous person. And we have the mercies of the wicked men. And I think this is potentially quite an ironic use of the word mercies or compassions. What they think of as being merciful is not merciful at all in this context, which may be a slight indication of what we were talking about before, of if you're wicked, you're necessarily also foolish. You don't understand morality. You might think something is merciful, and actually it's not merciful at all. And in fact, what he thinks is merciful turns out to be achsari, turns out to be cruelty. And that term is a very forceful term. It's often used in the context of military brutality in the Hebrew Bible. So wickedness here being defined in terms of its kind of sub-virtues and vices. So being defined in terms of not really merciful, but actually brutal. So that's the second half. And when the two halves come together, you get this kind of clever interplay of parallelism. And this is one of the things that I find really fascinating with Proverbs, where you shove the two halves together and suddenly you get all these implications that start to come out. So we might infer, for example, from the fact that the wicked man doesn't really know what's merciful, the righteous man, by comparison, does understand what's merciful. Similarly, the wicked man probably doesn't know the soul of his cattle, because that's something that the righteous man does. Other implications may be that it's merciful to know the soul of your cattle, and it's cruel to disregard the soul of your cattle. In fact, it's a sort of brutal action akin to military brutality. So that's kind of the gist of what's going on there. It's interesting to me that the righteous man doesn't act towards his cattle based on any set of rules and regulations in this proverb, but rather that it's the natural outflow of his righteous character. So, that's a little bit then about virtue ethics and how it might work vis-a-vis non-human animals in this proverb, and there are other examples of this in the book of Proverbs, I would suggest as well. Let's turn to my final area for reflection, which is about care ethics. And I see this exemplified particularly in narrative texts. So we started with a rights-based approach, and we thought about how that roots ethics in entitlements and corresponding obligations. And then we've just seen the virtue ethics approach, which roots ethics in developing a virtuous character. By contrast, a care ethics approach roots ethics particularly in relationships and compassion. It's been articulated most fully in the feminist ethical literature. Seminally, a feminist ethicist called Carol Gillingham wrote a book, I think in the 1980s, called In a Different Voice, where she looked at non-dominant forms of ethical reasoning. Most of the ethical literature at her time was this kind of rights-based general principles, and she wanted to say that actually there are other forms of ethics based in care and compassion which should be taken as seriously. So to put it in sort of simple terms, care ethics entails, I think, at least 3 important shifts away from traditional ethical theories. So firstly, it shifts away from absolute principles and it moves towards specific situations. Care ethicists argue that traditional theories, by trying to come up with these absolute principles, can actually end up flattening moral complexity. Care ethicists argue that moral experiences can't be just reduced to abstractions. There's not going to be a simple abstraction that will go at all places and all times. Rather, they suggest ethics should be much more flexible and responsive to particularities. They have received some pushback on this, with people saying actually we do need some ethical norms, we do need some principles, and so they don't always deny that principles are helpful, but just suggest that they don't always apply. So that's the first shift, from general principles to specific situations. The second is a shift away from rational reflection and towards more embodied and emotive forms of ethics. So traditional theories tend to root ethics in philosophical reflection, in some sense of objectivity, whereas care ethicists say actually our ethical instincts are based in, are instinctual, they're based in emotions, they're based in affect, they're based in embodied experiences. And so they kind of push back against the idea that anything can be objective in ethical terms, and said actually we should listen to our instinctive, emotional, ethical impulses. So that's the second shift, away from rational reflection towards embodied emotion. And then the third shift is away from kind of detached ethics towards an ethics of relationship. So traditional theories tend to focus on individuals, an individual's rights or an individual's obligations, whereas care ethics focuses, rather than individuals, on connectivity, on the relationships themselves that happen and communities. They suggest that lives are inextricably entangled together, and so we should look at that kind of knotty tangle rather than trying to pull out people and distinguish them. It centralises moments of personal encounter and relationships that happen in those moments. And for these reasons, they stress things like empathy, sympathy, love, attentiveness as being core ethical virtues. So that's care ethics. It has been applied to animal ethics by people like Carol Adams and Josephine Donovan, who published this collection of essays, The Feminist Care Tradition in Animal Ethics, a few years ago. And the three shifts of animal ethics can be quite helpful, the three shifts of care ethics can be quite helpful for thinking about animals. So the fact that it focalises specific situations can be quite helpful when we're thinking about many, many different species, many individuals within those species, many, many different contexts that we might be thinking about animals in. So sometimes it might be helpful to think about those particularities rather than the abstract objective principles. The shift towards kind of embodied and emotive capacities can sort of decentralise the rational intellect. And I mentioned at the start, that's been quite central as a kind of criterion which puts humans against other animals or higher than other animals. And so the shift away from that can make room for other animals, perhaps. And then the shift towards relationships can take seriously that very real relationships can and do occur between humans and animals. So it takes seriously the possibility of communication, of interspecies dialogue through non-linguistic signals. And all of this perhaps fits better with people's instinctive ethical impulses. When people experience strong ethical drives towards animals, this is the sort of thing that they're often thinking of. So I want to give my cats the best life possible, not because I'm consciously reflecting on their rights, not because I'm a particularly virtuous person, but because I love my cats and I care for them. So that's my kind of instinctive ethical drive. So that's how we might think about care ethics in relation to animals. Let's think about whether or how this might play out in certain biblical texts. I think that the ethical complexity of care ethics is not necessarily reflected in the legal codes, which we started with, or in the proverbial literature, which we looked at next, because both of those do focus on general principles. Rather, I think it's best exemplified in narrative literature, these stories, particular stories, which are better equipped to deal with ethical complexity. So the example I want to give comes from the second book of Samuel. So the context here is, this is a dialogue between the prophet Nathan and King David. And it happens just after, you probably know the story where David sleeps with Bathsheba and then kills her husband. Nathan then comes up and tells him this story. So the first part of it is here. It says, and the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said, there were two men in a certain city, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb which he bought. And he brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink of his cup and lie in his arms, and it was like a daughter to him. So Nathan here is giving a kind of a moral parable to David through this little narrative vignette. So these verses that I've just given you give this kind of the situation that's being set up, and then in the subsequent verses that we'll look later, we'll see how the situation is violated. I think that the three shifts of animal ethics, of care ethics, that we thought about a moment ago are evident in this vignette. So it focuses on this very specific situation, this relationship between the poor man and his ewe lamb. It focuses on the particularities of their relationship. It's though the camera is zooming right in on this one man with the lamb in his arms, right into the intimate details. So this is a very specific situation, which is not to say that it's not without analogy, because in the context it will turn out that this is precisely an analogy for the situation with Bathsheba, and yet nonetheless it's presented in these very particular terms. It also exemplifies the idea of embodiment and emotion within ethics. So the language here is very bodily and physical, the man lies in his arms, wherever it is. Going down, lie in his arms, there we go, in his arms. And actually the Hebrew there, I don't have room on this slide to put the Hebrew, but it's his chayk, which is his bosom. It's quite a maternal image. Elsewhere, children lie in their mother's chayk, which fits in with the broader context as well. And indeed, there is this close relationship, that was the third shift towards relationship. The lamb here is like a daughter to him. It grows up with his sons. It seems to be she seems to be part of his family in this context. And I was doing some research on this story for a different project, but I was very interested in learning about actual relationships between lambs and people. And it seemed from the kind of scientific literature on this that characteristics or behaviours like feeding and handling in particular are those which create an attachment between a lamb and a person. So it was interesting to me that that's precisely what we have here. We have feeding, eating of his morsel, drinking from his cup, and we have handling, lying in his bosom, which can create these attachments. So we have in this vignette then, I would suggest, a little mini example of a relationship of care which results in ethical behaviours towards this lamb. However, in the story, this relationship is going to be violated. So this is how the text continues. Now there came a traveller to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who'd come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb, and he prepared it for the man who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who'd done this deserves to die. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity." So the crime here of the theft and the slaughter of the lamb is deemed to be so heinous that David condemns the man to death. And again we may see the three central aspects of care ethics. So we have here the specificity, we have the particular violation, and also the particular punishment that David gives. This idea of restoring a lamb fourfold is similar to what we find in other texts, particularly in the book of Exodus that we saw before, but not exactly the same, particularly because it's coupled with a death sentence. He deserves to die. We also have an embodied and emotional reaction. So David responds emotionally. His anger was greatly kindled, and he condemns the man because he had no pity. So he's seeing the heart of the violation here to be an emotional thing. He didn't pity, he didn't have compassion, would be another interpretation of this verb, chamal, wasn't compassionate. So the ethical sensibility here rooted in emotion and in relationship. And the narrative logic seems to suggest that the crime is so heinous precisely because it's violated this relationship between the man and his lamb. So that, in summary then, the ethical thrust of this parable seems to suggest that there's a relationship between the animal and the care that should be extended towards the animal underlies the ethics here. So, let me conclude, and let's just take stock of where we have come. So I've argued against the view that the Hebrew Bible has nothing to say about animal ethics, and I've also argued against the view that's prevalent in some animal ethics literature that the Hebrew Bible straightforwardly advocates you can exploit animals as much as you want. Rather, I've suggested that the Hebrew Bible is much more complex and contains some nascent ethical impulses that have today crystallised into these different ethical theories. I've attempted to demonstrate this through 3 examples. So we saw the animal rights approach, which grants animals basic entitlements, safeguarded in law, and we saw that may be exemplified in some legal injunctions in the Hebrew Bible. We saw the virtue ethics approach, which roots morality in a virtuous disposition, and which may work itself out towards animals in the book of Proverbs. And we saw a care ethics approach, which centralises specificity, emotion, and relationship, and which may be demonstrated in this narrative we saw in the book of Samuel. If I had longer, I could have given more examples to demonstrate each of these approaches, and there are other approaches as well that I think we could have spoken about. So, for example, Martha Nussbaum, who's an ethicist, she focused on distinctive capabilities of different species, which I think we see in the Hebrew Bible as well. Some ethicists called Donaldson and Kimlicka look at political theory, distinguishing between animals who are citizens, denizens, sovereigns. So there are all these other approaches as well, which I think we could speak about. And also intersectional ethics, which highlights the way that animal ethics is tied up with interhuman ethical impulses as well. I also think it would be really interesting to think about animals not just as the objects of ethical action, but also as the subject of ethics, as moral beings in themselves. However, I don't have any time for that today, unfortunately, but I hope that this has been enough to sort of provoke you to think a little bit more about what I think is an underexplored area of the Hebrew Bible. So thank you very much for your attention.
Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? Sally has a microphone. Anything you'd like to say? Just still absorbing.
Maybe it's that new area of the boat.
It is actually. Might have to send them to you by email. Yeah, that was extremely interesting. Thank you. I think most of us haven't thought about things like that before.
Yeah, I think that's been like my general sense of talking about this with people. In fact, I've just written a book about animals in the books of Samuel, and the question I always get asked is, "Oh, are there any animals in Samuel?" Yes, there are lots, but people don't. It's not something we really think about. But once you start reading the Bible, thinking about these issues, you find these questions are everywhere. These animals are everywhere. All over the text, which makes sense because it was written in a context where everybody was in agriculturalists pretty much, apart from your elites in society. So everyone was interacting with animals on a daily basis.
I think it's interesting that Lorna, who makes our posters, I think she took the sheep on it from one of your
publication.
Yes.
Oh, possibly, yes.
We tend to think of sheep
Yeah.
because of our favourite psalm, because we're Scottish.
Yeah, yes, and I mean the Lord is my shepherd is a classic example of this, this sort of relationship between the shepherd, which of course you get in the New Testament as well. The good shepherd is the one who goes after the lamb, and we tend to think that in metaphorical terms, but actually it's also can be taken in literal terms. The reason that works is because actual shepherds had actual relationship with actual sheep.
Graham, time to...
Yes, thank you very much. I'm interested in the fact that Jesus is referred to as the Lamb of God, and that suggests a very profound relationship between Jesus and the Father.
Yes, absolutely. And as I said, I'm not a New Testament scholar, but I think it's a really important example of the way that humans, animals and the divine all sort of become entangled together. And of course that metaphor relies very much on the sacrificial complex, which is a very difficult area, and scholars disagree a lot about what exactly is going on in sacrifice. But I think one of the things it does is to kind of sacralize the animal, and you see that epitomized in Jesus. And the fact that that metaphor works is because you have this idea of the sacrifice of the animal, who in some sense becomes akin to something divine in that interaction.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, okay. Yes, I found that most interesting and quite challenging. I was thinking, I think your examples all dealt with domesticated animals. Now it may be that, you know, if you'd been choosing other examples, you know, we might have got into the ethics of interaction with wild animals.
No, I think that's really important. I think that when I speak about animals, it can potentially be unhelpful because there are really important distinctions. And I think the wild domestic one is crucial actually, because domestic animals are the ones that you're going to have a relationship with, the ones that you're going to care for, and would be in some sense part of your society, so you'd need to have laws which include them. I do think we need different ethical tools for thinking about non-domesticated animals. So in my final point where I said, oh, there are other ethical theories, I think that those ones could work well for non-domesticated animals. So, for example, Nussbaum's capabilities approach looks at different species and their different capabilities. I think that resonates a lot with the end of Job, where God gives this amazing speech about all these different wild animals, and each animal sort of is its individual self and does the thing that that animal does and is wild and free and wonderful. So I think that might be a helpful way to think about that. And then in terms of the political theory of some animals are citizens, this is taken from Donaldson and Kingmaker. They say some animals are citizens, like your domestic animals to whom you might extend rights. Some animals they describe as denizens, who would be kind of like your pests, your rodents and things, and I'm not sure what to do with them. But the other animals, they say wild animals should be seen as having their own kind of independent sovereignty. And I think there's some really interesting examples of that in places like Isaiah, where you have the desolation of the human city, and then all the animals move into the city. They kind of set up their own little mini societies in the city. So Isaiah 34 would be an example of that. So yes, you're right. My examples, I think, work particularly well for domesticated animals, but I think there are other ethical tools for dealing with the non-domesticated.
I was interested when you were talking following Graham's question about sacrifice. In other religions, sacrifice is a big part of it. I worked in Bangladesh for 6 years, and the very first Eid that they had, the one where they remember Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, and there's thousands and thousands and thousands of animals killed by Muslims to celebrate that, you know, at the side of the road. I found that very difficult for my first one, until I kind of chatted to Muslim friends and found out a bit more about it. But the first time it was really quite difficult, but they're really into the sacrifice aspect in a big way.
Yeah, it's prevalent all over the world, and I think sacrifice is very complex because I think it has these two like conflicting impulses. So there's the one which is something to do with the animal kind of being a way to get to the divine, and in some sense is divinized, and in some sense becomes sacred, and all of this. And also, a lot of scholars in this area have spoken about the kind of the reason why it's important, the reason why it's a sacrifice is because you care so much about this animal. If you have this relationship with this animal, if they're part of your kin, then it really is a sacrifice to give them up. Which can make sense a little bit of the kind of child sacrifice stuff, which is obviously a horrible thing to think about, but does happen in the Hebrew Bible. You mentioned Isaac, who's not sacrificed, but then you have Jephthah's daughter, who is sacrificed. And there are other examples as well. And I think that kind of relationship of care, some scholars have said that's kind of at the heart of what's going on in sacrifice. So there's that side of it, but then of course there's the kind of horrific violence aspect of it as well, which is very hard to square.
we evolve.
Yes.
Well, we'd like to thank you very much for coming along
Thank you for having me.
and opening up our minds to something we've probably never thought about before, particularly. And I think that will trigger things off. You know, we'll be listening to things, reading bits in the Bible, seeing things on the television, but it all fits in there as we think.
Great, well, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you so
very
much
much
for listening,
indeed.
everybody.